When a life stalls, we treat it as an embarrassing failure of discipline. But what if your prolonged delay isn't an inability to launch, but an active refusal by your unconscious mind to build on a fragile foundation? The late bloomer isn't playing the same game on a slower clock. They are trapped in an early demolition of the self, preparing for an architectural depth that early success simply cannot survive. Walk into any professional setting in your late 20s or 30s, and you will encounter an unwritten social hierarchy measured entirely by velocity. Modern culture overwhelmingly rewards early alignment, the rapid acquisition of a visible title, a predictable career trajectory, and a clean, unambiguous answer to what you do. Against this hyper-accelerated backdrop, internal hesitation looks identical to a personal defect. You watch former classmates settle comfortably into defined positions, while your own life feels like an exhausting exercise in lateral drift. You assume you simply lack stamina, discipline, or raw ambition, quietly convincing yourself that you missed a critical turning point while everyone else moved decisively forward into the world. Yet, if you observe human psychological development with greater precision, a far stranger pattern begins to surface. Not all human growth follows a linear trajectory, and certain minds are structurally incapable of early, frictionless adaptation. Consider the quiet exhaustion of working relentlessly without anything presentable to show for it. You absorb complex information, collect fragmented real-world impressions, and endure the frustrating cycle of trial and error, yet your efforts yield no marketable milestone or presentable trophy. The external world interprets this silence as inertia or aimlessness. Internally, however, a dense subterranean synthesis is taking place. You are not failing to execute. You are struggling to reconcile parts of reality that refuse to be simplified into an immediate, presentable output. This reveals a profound psychological paradox. Early achievement usually requires premature specialization, the rapid shaping of the ego to satisfy immediate social demands. The early bloomer quickly learns what the market rewards and trims away any internal ambiguity that threatens efficiency. But what happens to the personality that inherently resists this compromise? What of the individual whose internal blueprint demands the integration of contradictory instincts, deep philosophical doubts, and unyielding creative standards? For such a person, early alignment with standardized metrics is not merely difficult, it is psychologically intolerable. To succeed early, they would be forced to amputate essential, unintegrated parts of their genuine nature. This creates a deeply unsettling realization. The paralyzing friction felt during your 20s or 30s might not be evidence of an embarrassing lag, but evidence of psychological weight. A lightweight structure can be erected in a few weeks, but a foundation designed to support immense architectural depth requires years of silent excavation, clearing away superficial soil before a single stone can be placed. Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung observed that the first half of life is dedicated to constructing the ego, while the second half demands its radical, often painful transformation. What if certain individuals are forced into that transformative friction far earlier, enduring the collapse of fragile structures before they ever showcase them to the world? The long delay is not an empty vacuum. It is the necessary cost of a far larger self quietly coming into form, preparing to confront questions that early success was never built to answer. Consider the standard cultural narrative around late achievement. We tend to view the late bloomer as someone who simply required extra time to master the same rules, acquire the same skills, or conquer the same anxieties that others resolved in their early 20s. This comforting myth frames late success as a mere delayed arrival at a shared finish line. But this completely misinterprets the architecture of the human mind. The late bloomer is not playing the same game on a slower clock. They are navigating an entirely different developmental matrix. Where early achievers excel at mirroring external expectations, the late bloomer is often structurally incapable of uncritical adaptation. Their psychological makeup refuses to accept superficial validation as a substitute for genuine internal coherence. In Jungian terms, while the early bloomer constructs a highly effective persona, a functional social mask calibrated to meet immediate cultural demands, the individual destined for late blooming suffers from an unconscious resistance to this necessary compromise. When they attempt to force themselves into standardized molds, an active veto occurs. They spend hours obsessing over trivial administrative details, buying another course under the belief that they remain unready, or subtly missing deadlines because the work feels spiritually hollow. The friction they experience is not a moral failure of discipline, but an active rejection exercised by the deeper psyche. This reveals a disturbing paradox. The very traits typically labeled as developmental flaws in early adulthood, hypersensitivity, a reluctance to commit to narrow paths, persistent restlessness, and an acute awareness of unlived potential, are often the raw, unrefined components of a far larger psychological capacity. A vessel designed to carry intricate, highly nuanced perspectives cannot be assembled quickly. If forced into premature utility, it fractures. What the external world dismisses as aimlessness is frequently the turbulent, necessary process of allowing complex internal elements to collide, refine, and eventually synthesize. Yet recognizing this hidden dynamic offers only partial relief. It leaves us standing before a far more demanding dilemma. If this prolonged delay is actually an unconscious defense against a compromised life, why does it feel so profoundly agonizing? Why must the path toward genuine selfhood require such an arduous descent into obscurity before anything meaningful can be built? To understand this structural suffering, we must look beyond surface frustrations and examine the hidden mechanism of the shadow. To grasp why late bloomers suffer such prolonged developmental friction, we must enter the core of Carl Jung's depth psychology, the confrontation with the shadow. In early life, culture rewards the immediate suppression of ambiguity. To succeed quickly in school, entry-level careers, or social hierarchies, an individual must streamline their personality. They must discard inconvenient doubts, suppress unorthodox creative impulses, and bury aspects of themselves that do not yield clean, quantifiable efficiency. The early bloomer excels at this trade-off, locking away their internal contradictions in the unconscious realm, the shadow, in exchange for immediate social adaptation and visible momentum. For the late bloomer, however, this Faustian bargain continuously fails. The unconscious mind of a late bloomer refuses to stay quieted. Whatever talent, artistic impulse, or philosophical depth lies within their shadow actively disrupts their superficial efforts to conform. When they attempt to pursue a standard, uninspired path simply to keep pace with their peers, a subtle, persistent friction sabotages them. They find themselves rewriting a basic proposal 20 times, delaying critical career decisions out of an unspoken dread of living a fraudulent narrative, or feeling an acute sense of self-alienation whenever forced to recite corporate buzzwords. Their shadow acts not as a passive storage room for unwanted traits, but as an active force demanding integration. They cannot move forward cleanly because vital parts of their psychic energy remain locked in resistance. This reveals the true nature of their apparent delay. The late bloomer is not suffering from a lack of potential, but from an overflow of unintegrated energy. While society views their 20s and 30s as a wasted period of indecision, a far more dangerous and profound work is occurring beneath the surface, the forced integration of the shadow. They are compelled to confront their deepest fears, reconcile contradictory desires, and dismantle the fragile ego constructions that others rely on for comfort. They cannot advance until they retrieve the parts of themselves they were asked to sacrifice. Success, when it finally arrives, is not built on a hollow mask, but on a unified and resilient psychological foundation. Yet, integrating the shadow is only the first phase of this subterranean transformation. Reclaiming suppressed energy explains where the late bloomer's hidden depth originates, but it does not fully explain how this internal realignment translates into real-world mastery. To understand how internal chaos suddenly crystallizes into extraordinary late-stage authority, we must examine a second, even more profound mechanism within Jungian thought, the shift from ego-driven ambition to the overarching guidance of the self. To understand the second half of this transformation, we must turn to Carl Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you inherently are, rather than who society conditioned you to be. Most early achievement is governed entirely by the ego. The ego seeks security, status, social approval, and measurable control. It builds a life based on external benchmarks. For many, this linear strategy works remarkably well for decades, creating the illusion of smooth, uninterrupted progress. But when a life is built exclusively by the ego, it remains fragile, susceptible to sudden existential collapse when external validation falters. The late bloomer operates under a radically different psychological center of gravity. Rather than being directed by the immediate demands of the ego, their trajectory is subtly orchestrated by what Jung called the self, the central archetype of order, wholeness, and destiny within the collective unconscious. The self does not care about artificial timelines, social prestige, or youth-obsessed metrics. Its sole objective is psychological completion. When an individual's conscious plans conflict with their deeper blueprint, the self actively intervenes. It induces friction, strips away false motivations, and dismantles premature endeavors, effectively sabotaging short-term success to force a far broader internal integration. This reframes the entire nature of the late bloomer's struggle. The long years spent feeling lost or directionless were not a wasted detour. They were a process of circumambulation, a psychological circling around a central core of truth until the personality is ready to hold it. Where the early achiever climbs a straight ladder, the late bloomer descends into a spiral. They re-examine past missteps, gather seemingly disparate insights, and endure repeated cycles of shedding outgrown identities. The friction they felt was not a sign that they were broken, but a signal that their ego was being forcibly dethroned so that a far more resilient structure could take its place. The consequences of this shift are profound. When success finally emerges from this long process of individuation, it carries a qualitatively different weight. It is not an unstable construct designed to impress others, but an organic expression of an integrated psyche. Because the late bloomer has already survived the collapse of their artificial persona, they are virtually immune to the midlife crises that frequently devastate early achievers. Yet, this grand theoretical framework remains abstract until we observe how it actually manifests within the quiet, granular reality of ordinary lived human experience and personal choice. In daily life, this inner alchemy leaves distinct, observable tracks. You might recall sitting through professional meetings in your late 20s, watching colleagues passionately debate minor quarter-end metrics, while an overwhelming sense of distance washed over you. You were not arrogant. You were simply incapable of manufacturing artificial urgency for a game that felt hollow. During those years, your resistance often expressed itself through quiet micro-sabotages, spending hours formatting font styles on a draft instead of writing its substance, or peeling the label off a glass bottle in silent detachment while peers networked around you. To an outsider, you appeared erratic, but internally, an unyielding psychological filter was rejecting premature compromise. This experience becomes intensely personal when you realize that your inability to commit was actually a refusal to betray yourself. When asked the inevitable question, "What are you working on now?" you might have caught yourself raising the pitch of your voice by half an octave, artificially trying to project enthusiasm for a temporary role you knew was a dead end. Yet if you look back at your private archives, old journal entries, abandoned notebooks, or early research files, you discover that your mind was never dormant. You were quietly observing human behavior and accumulating real-world friction, building an internal repository of unvarnished insight. This is where abstract psychological theory transforms into lived authority. When a late bloomer finally steps into their calling, they do so with an unmistakable presence. They do not need to perform confidence or hide behind corporate buzzwords, because their authority was forged through years of relentless self-confrontation. The skills they bring to the world are not shallow techniques learned from a weekend seminar, but deeply rooted expressions of an integrated identity. They have developed a rare immunity to social posturing, having already survived the long trial of their own obscurity. They trust the slow rhythms of their own mind over external demands. Yet, reaching this realization requires confronting a final, highly uncomfortable truth. Recognizing the psychological necessity of your delay is reassuring, but it also strips away your final defense. If your prolonged obscurity was not an accident, but a necessary preparation for a larger responsibility, then you can no longer view yourself as a helpless victim of circumstance. You are forced to stand at a critical threshold, looking directly at the gap between the person you have been performing as and the immense, unfulfilled potential quietly demanding to be lived. It is exhausting to live inside a prolonged delay you cannot easily explain to the people who care about you. You know the quiet discomfort of watching aging parents or concerned partners attempt to read your silence, wondering when your intellect will finally convert into something stable, legible, and safe. You have felt the subtle impulse to pivot conversations away from your career progress, defaulting to safe, neutral topics simply to shield yourself from their gentle, probing concern. In those moments, the burden of being a late bloomer is not an abstract theory. It is an immediate, social friction. It is the haunting suspicion that you are simply constructing elaborate excuses for a life that failed to launch, comparing your unfinished internal chaos to everyone else's tidy external reality. Yet, if you examine that friction closely, a different truth emerges. The very fact that you experience such acute conflict over your unexpressed capacity proves that it remains intact. Dead potential does not generate tension. The restlessness that haunts you is the psyche's stubborn refusal to let you settle for a premature, truncated existence. It is the friction of a self that is simply too vast for the narrow, off-the-shelf roles you attempted to inhabit. You are not standing idle. You are being stripped of false alignments. The delay was never a reflection of laziness. It was the slow labor of constructing an internal architecture capable of holding who you actually are. When you stop viewing your timeline as an embarrassing anomaly, the nature of your struggle shifts completely. You begin to see that the long years spent in obscurity were not wasted time, but necessary incubation. A period where your core values were forged away from the distorting validation of early applause. You realize that authentic maturity is measured not by speed, but by the structural integrity of what you ultimately inhabit. This leaves you standing at a quiet, unavoidable threshold. You can continue to mourn the fast, frictionless start you never had, or you can finally claim the weight, depth, and responsibility of the trajectory you are actually living. In the final analysis, late blooming is not a tragic delay in arrival, but the fulfillment of a fundamentally different human architecture. The early achiever learns how to conquer external systems, but the late bloomer is forced to navigate and integrate the depths of the self first. The long, agonizing period that felt like a curse reveals itself as an act of profound psychological preservation. By withholding early, easy victory, the deeper psyche prevented you from constructing a life on a fragile persona that would eventually crumble under its own shallow weight. What society dismisses as a late start is often simply the time required for a complex mind to achieve wholeness. You were not broken, nor were you forgotten by fate. You were engaged in a far more demanding craft, the slow, unhurried forging of an authentic identity. The crucial question was never whether you would arrive on a standardized schedule, but whether you would have the courage to inhabit the full depth of who you were becoming. The clock was never ticking against you. It was simply waiting for you to step forward.